Okay, so as always, it'll take a minute for the board to catch up. I will read questions from the message board, but first I'll open the floor to you all.
So the question is, does the psychoanalytic monoculture that I identified in cultural materials have a clinical resonance? Could it affect, I assume deleteriously is the implication, care for patients, or whatever we call them, clients, when I'm using. My own suspicion is that the monoculture is perhaps more to do with the use of psychoanalytic ideas in cultural theory. I think probably in clinical practice, I think it's almost certainly true, it's much more eclectic, much more diverse. Psychoanalytic ideas are used in a much more diverse, pick and mix kind of way, and there's probably much more variety. And I think that's partly to do with the context of psychoanalytic practice, particularly in the UK. You're not going to get it on the NHS. It's very, very uncommon. So essentially, you pay your money and you take your choice. And if it doesn't work for you, you can go somewhere else. So I think on the whole, such psychoanalytic practices still continues, and of course it can continue in sort of more psychotherapeutic context, not the strict analytic setting. It's probably more diverse. Indeed, it's almost a reverse position, because I think it's probably very hard to find a Lacanian analysis in the UK. There are some around. I was speaking to somebody a few days ago who knew one and had used one. In fact, Lacanian theory is very, very marginal in the UK at that clinical level. Whereas I think most clinical practice is probably much more eclectic, much more informed by whoever, Winnicott, Fairbairn, Klein, whoever. So I think it's probably much more healthy diversity in what goes on clinically.
I mean, this speaks back to a question that came up in the very first lecture, which and it also kind of speaks to something that you brought up about what would patients say about their contributions to psychoanalytic thought, which I think is really interesting about the kind of social construction of these things, and then we kind of pass them off to big names, which this course itself is somewhat guilty of course. But
yeah, well, I have another question. I'm interested in connecting all these figures to Easter and the art. So earlier you mentioned, when you were talking about the roots to the unconscious, you mentioned obviously the cultural materialities like artwork. So my question is, when actually in voice and Lacan theory, but also according to you, when analyzing a piece of work, especially if it's autobiographical, who is writing? The I am is the ego or the it? So how do we approach psychoanalytically as an autobiographical text?
So how do we approach psychoanalytically an autobiographical text? Mind boggles. I mean, I would have to say that my initial approach to any autobiographical text would probably not be psychoanalytic. I would think much more recently just about the conventions of autobiographical writing in a straightforward way. And it's one of these positions where you think, well, to what extent is a psychoanalytic perspective useful in the idea of constructing some kind of autobiographical self? And I think my sense is that they can be, but you have to be a little bit careful, because it's a bit too easy just to kind of turn the handle of the grinder and you get to the same answer, which is the autobiographical self is a construction. Psychoanalysis says so. And so the trick is perhaps looking for something that is genuinely illuminating in that encounter, because it's quite easy to say, well, there's lots of retrospective rationalizations and instructions of mastery and self-control in any autobiographical narrative. That all happened for the best. I did it because it wanted to. It got me to where I wanted to be or had to be. Kind of Oprah Winfrey nonsense. It all happens for the best. So you can see that stuff going on. I think that the far trickier thing is finding a productive psychoanalytic approach to it, because in a certain sense it's so manifest. I think, well, why would I use psychoanalysis specifically? The general sensibility there. But where would a particular theory be particularly illuminating? And I think that is a harder issue. So I'm afraid that's sort of a dodge, a swerve. You got me down to rights.
Well, when we do biographical criticism in literary studies, and I say we because I also do literary work, the tendency is to kind of start to psychoanalyze, right? To find the trauma in so-and-so's expression of, there's a great article about the way that war trauma expresses itself in the rise of the novel, right? And so it's interesting that it's such a kind of, speaking of compulsions, it's a compulsive reaction in some ways to say, well, this is trauma, this is mourning, this is melancholy, this is...
I would almost say that this is part of what I also do as somebody who uses psychoanalytic theories is occasionally try and clip its wings.
Yeah.
My immediate response is to say, well, let's try not to talk about trauma, because I think there's something very, very fishy about trauma discourse and its power in our culture. And I get particularly twitchy around ideas of intergenerationally transmitted psychological trauma, whereby you, as a third or fourth generation successor, are somehow inheriting the trauma of your forefathers. Perhaps I'm the 10th generation survivor of the Highland clearances and I'm traumatized by it. You get to that kind of logic. So there's something quite fishy about the way it's employed, and it almost seems to be working as a psychologized version of ideas of racial or ethnic essence at times. So I'm quite suspicious of an intergenerational context, and somewhat suspicious of it in a biographical context. And indeed, there have been so many searching critiques of the idea of specific traumatic conditions, particularly PTSD. There's quite a lot of literature on that, problematizing that. Is it a specific thing as PTSD, or could it be anxiety and depression and not something that needs a distinct category? What is really going on there? So trauma discourse is one of these things where I want to say maybe we should try and not be psychoanalytic for a while and think about other things that are going on that could help us understand this phenomenon.
And probably considering the idea of collective unconscious and that moment, this will make sense when we want to differentiate the female, male identity and working with that. Because if we think about women's writing, it's not the same as male writing. So the female authority when writing, not just an autobiography, but even a text, is different from the male, and this doesn't depend on the subject experience, but on the female writing experience. So what we were saying before, that you mentioned when we were talking about the idea of man, the fact that man has to be tough, therefore kind of shutting away from tenderness. It's more or less the same as some female writer had to, face during, especially the 20th century, when they were approaching writing from a background where female writing was considered like not real literature and all the problems that we still experience and having to have an authority as a writer or as an artist. So I believe that here there could be some sort of interesting psychoanalytical insight in kind of analyzing the differences in writing, like writers between, say, female and male writing in a collective kind of world.
So it suggests there might be a kind of there might be a psychoanalytic fruitfulness in thinking about some of the collective patterns that we find in the gendering of writing and the problems faced maybe by female or maybe feminine writers entering into the literary market. Maybe, basically some contrast, would they have to turn into Hemingway in order to be, acknowledged? There's the epitome of masculine toughness. What are the wider cultural constancies of that compared to what a woman might have to do, the difficulties in acknowledging what a female or feminine writing would present? And perhaps there's some degree of purchase for psychoanalytic theory there, because there's a stubbornness about masculine ideals of authorship and authority, isn't there? And you can see a degree of distaste and dislike of of we might think of as feminine, crudely, virtues in writing. Yeah.
We're starting to pile up here on the board, so I'm going to start digging in, and I'm going to start with the earliest. So this is a question that is actually about the point that you made, critiquing or addressing the problems of Lacan's essay, The Mirror Stage. And I think this question is getting at something that I think we've been kicking around collectively, fairly consciously, sometimes unconsciously, having to do with our roles as researchers and with the call to create novelty, new knowledge, justified, true belief, that sort of thing, and that it needs to be kind of a new theory or it needs to be in some way creative. So what is the place, and is there a model in this kind of critique of the mirror stage for our own research? Not necessarily asserting a theory or offering new knowledge itself, but prompting new debate on existing theory or conceptions of knowledge. Does this count as knowledge creation? And could you say a little bit more about how it might offer a way into becoming critical thinkers and into developing our own intellectual narratives?
So if you were to do a Billick and a Tallis on Lacan, how would that be something that would feed into your own development as a researcher? Is it something you can? Is that the question? Is it something you can run with in terms of your own scholarly development and innovation, in a sense? Is that broadly what was asked? Yeah, I think so. I mean, in a way, this is a tricky one because in some way what I'm suggesting is that you just need very down-to-earth virtues in dealing with certain kind of things. Think about all the things that are the basics of your discipline, such as going to a source, looking for dependencies, and evaluating them. And I actually think, if anything, you could say that Lacan is the person who's in this position of forced novelty and innovation, and saying, before me was only Freud. And my picture of intellectual development is really that a few names come to prominence, but there's so much work is just done by people that we don't know about. And you can easily get in this position of, well, it almost sounds like the mirror stage, in which you strive to be this great, original, creative luminary, when so much work is really done by the people you've never heard of contributing. I mean, Lacan never mentions Wallon. That's where he gets a lot of this stuff. I do a lot of work on R.D. Lane, and the trend in Lane's scholarship and on Lane's ideas is that all the men are brilliant. You can very clearly see where he's taking other elements of his psychiatric and psychoanalytic culture and, dusting them off and working them on a bit, and then representing them, but not really expressing that dependency. So people have said, well, there's Winnicott, and there's Jaspers in there, and indeed there's a bit of Ian Suttie, who Lane read. So I think my take-home message, in a sense, would be what you're doing is probably good enough. You don't have to worry about some great creative leap, because they probably don't actually happen. And just working away on the problems in a reasonably rigorous, sober way will take you where you need to be, because this stuff about the great thinker is a myth. It's a folk history.
This ties into another question, though, about, as the writer puts it, our all-important impact. And this is another theme that we've been kind of kicking around almost every week without fail. We discuss impact in one way or another, because the way that because our jobs depend on it, our success depends on it, and the way that it is measured and assessed may or may not, have we decided? I don't think so, may or may not make certain assumptions about what constitutes knowledge, what counts. So another question here is, I'm particularly intrigued by the defense of Lacan in terms of it was good for the discipline. As researchers, it can be tempting to fall into the trap of defending our or others' work in terms of its purported importance to a field, even if there are manifest flaws. And when there is so much at stake, funding, career, breadth, etc., such tendencies become more pronounced. In my field, music, it is often practitioners working within academia who are the worst. They resent critical interrogation of their work. especially if they feel that such interrogation threatens their own credibility. Sometimes I get the feeling, looking at some projects, that there's a conspiracy of silence around certain ulterior motives to the extent of becoming cliches. Could these phenomena be argued as converging towards a form of Jungian collective unconscious, or are they squarely in the purview of the ego?
I don't think we need to postulate the transcendental a priori of cultural life. I think, the question suggests its own explanation there. But I think the question was indicating, well, is there a risk of some degree of intellectual conservatism? Because here you are as researchers making pitches for PhDs, and then afterwards you'll want to do your postdoctoral stuff, you'll need to go in front of hiring committees. And is there any sense in which you have to genuflect before the idols of the tribe as inherited by, tenured academics, even wrong? And of course have their position in review bodies within funding agencies and all the rest of it. I think that is something that you do have to think about, and think about very carefully. I would say I would only offer that defence of Lacan in the mirror stage insofar as you could say, well, that initial risky gambit paid off in something. The investment was recouped by something that was less tenuous. And you can debate about whether that happened or not. But certainly I take the point, you could say the entire foundations are rotting and the whole building's going to collapse. And what are you going to do if you are unfortunate enough to hear my lecture, take seriously what I've said, it could happen, and then think, hang on, I've got to somehow, what am I going to do with my Lacanian third chapter of my PhD? Well, that's a good question. However, here my defence comes back again, which is you've always got the defence of scholarly protocols. You can always say, here for instance is research by Billick, or I went off and looked at that source and assessed its plausibility according to succeeding research and found it was wanting. Or that theory purports to explain something but really adds no explanatory value at all. And that should always be the card that I think you play first of all. If that doesn't work, you're not a supervisor. Or think carefully about your external examiner. But I do this, and this is tricky because, some of these things are they are, to use a cliche, sacred cows. And you do have to be careful before you slaughter them too publicly.
Yes. Yes. Some of us have learned that the hard way. So another question, and this is, again, we're turning a little bit, but it's, first of all, fabulous lecture. And could Dr. Miller say if there's any link and some overlap with Bourdieu's habitus and cultural capital and Freud's psychoanalysis, or maybe the reading of psychoanalysis that you're giving us tonight, which includes Ian Seti, and I entreat those of you on computers or near them to Google Ian Seti.
Yes, so perhaps the implication of the question is there's something about psychoanalytic cultural theory in which acquisition of it is a form of cultural capital, even outside of the academy. So, particularly outside of the academy, at a certain point, or...
Yeah, and I would imagine also that it functions... the one implication, or I'm reading this now, so the author of the question is no longer speaking, so I apologize if I'm getting this wrong. But it seems to me, too, that certain people get written out by virtue of not having, the right kind of cultural capital. But at the same time, if we look at the way that ideas are circulated and constructed, that it is very much social, and it's about economies of thought.
Yes. Well, I think that's absolutely correct. I think there's a certain sense there is some kind of, would you call it an economy? I think that is a productive way of thinking about this, and our tendency to write certain people out of cultural theory, not to acknowledge their contribution, and thus to lose the value of that contribution. Is cultural capital, well, it's certainly an apt idea to play with and to think about it. did Ian Suttie lack cultural capital? Is that why he's forgotten? I mean, it could be so adventitious. He died early. You know, it's very unfortunate. But I take the point with maybe somebody like W.R.D. Fairbairn, the Edinburgh-based psychoanalyst, heavily informed by Suttie, influential upon clinical practice, very interesting. Lots of stuff going on there with overlaps with theology, and again, very, very little known. And something, yes, and there is a question we'd have to ask there, because we all know about Melanie Klein, the object, well, if you know about psychoanalytic theory, you know about Klein in London, in certain circles, but you don't know about Fairbairn, who's in Scotland, and broadly based in Edinburgh. Now, there are weird adventitious factors there, like Fairbairn had this odd phobia about peeing away from home, but there are more systemic factors about his geographical and cultural location, and some of his reference points. I mean, he was, alas, socially and politically conservative. Fairbairn was in some very sympathetic to the Church of Scotland. These are very uncruel coordinates. But he still was a theoretical innovator despite all that. So there is, I think, something to be said for that understanding of why certain people are neglected and why we're discouraged from using them, or why it's harder just to get to them.
While we're on the topic of study, I have a question specifically about the tender unconscious. Curious to know thoughts on contemporary approaches to psychoanalytic theory. For example, Dan Hughes' dyadic developmental therapy, which is premised on the PACE model, playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, empathy, and which seems to draw on Sutie's tender unconscious.
Yeah, I would say that this is one of these things where we've actually got a lively clinical tradition at the moment that is almost completely, I won't say dissociated, but separated from what we get in cultural theory. So there are lots of Suttie-like ideas about early life being about relatedness and play and transitional objects and companionship, and quite different ideas about the repression or changes in relationships of love. You give up the love of the mother, in quotes, not because it's repressed, but because you sort of say, well, she needs to get on with her own life. I freely renounce it. So there are all kinds of ideas that are there in contemporary psychoanalytic theory, which is much more influenced by empirical child observation studies, the kind of stuff that Colwyn Trevarthen does. And nobody's quite asked the question, I think, of how we take that living research tradition and fruitfully connect it back to the cultural realm. I don't think that it's been attempted, but it's often rather, it's been attempted by clinicians who don't quite really know how to grapple with cultural materials very well. And that question still remains to be answered. What would we like to have a psychoanalytic cultural theory that worked with where psychoanalytic practice was at the moment, which is a very different model of the personality, and psychological development is much more sensitive to developmental psychology and even to new neurological and neurophysiological studies. So that question is entirely open. I don't think it should be asked.
Does this fall in line with some of the work that's being done in affect studies and affect theory, where I'm thinking of CNI on cuteness?
Well, I'm not honest. My ignorance is exposed. It sounds entirely plausible, but I'd like to know more about that. Yeah.
So this is a question on the style of Lacan. A really interesting point earlier about Lacan's psychoanalytic style and authority. Perhaps this insight could be extended. I was thinking in particular of the cultural genealogy of psychoanalysis, of the way the analyst supersedes the priest or the rabbi, and wondered how the spiritual affective transference thereby implied between these institutions, religion and psychoanalysis, is at play in how some psychoanalytic knowledge claims work.
I mean, you can certainly, there are various reference points for this. Of course, Foucault is very famous, but of course you can see as, certain spiritual and religious practices and discourses being handed down to the psychoanalyst or to the therapist. The confessional, as Foucault is kind of seen, if you like, confess your sin, you'll find it at work within you, confess your fundamentally sexual essence or nature. So I think you can certainly see that. And what might be more interesting is to say, is there a productive or interesting? So this isn't simply, if you like, a swipe at psychoanalysis, but is there a sense in which there might be, in some sense, a valuable spiritual tradition? I mean, I'm not in any way religious, but you could ask that question. Is there a valuable spiritual tradition that gets handed down to a therapeutic context? Certainly, some people have thought there were, and some of the adaptations of psychotherapeutic ideas in Scotland have had this very obvious religious spiritual twist to them, in which there's something in the interpersonal encounter which is holy or sacred. Now, I've got no view on that, but you can see that as if you like, a less suspicious, more charitable way of viewing that genealogy and continuity.
Well, unless there's a final question from the room, we should probably stop here. I want to thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, wonderful discussion. Thank you all for being here.